So welcome back to Homosexuality in the Bible. This is our third session tonight. And before we get into the material for tonight, I want to ask you, as I've alluded to on several occasions already, if most of you would be available to do this next week on Tuesday evening. Would you raise your hands if you could do that next Tuesday? Okay. We're going to do it next Tuesday at the same time because on Wednesday I have to leave to go to Houston where I'm preaching at this network conference. So it'll be Tuesday next week at 7 rather than Wednesday. And then we'll have, after that, only one more week. We'll be able to finish the rest of the material in 2 weeks after tonight. So it'll be a total of 5 sessions. So next Tuesday at 7 and then the following Wednesday at 7 will be our final session together. So we've had a lot of response from the posting of videos on Facebook. People either love it or they think I'm the devil. And I'm used to being seen in both lights, so don't worry about me. I'm a big boy. The question, I do have a little smart mouth sometimes, so the question I have for the ones who think I'm the devil is I'd like to know where they got their doctorates from. Okay, so that's my one moment of being smarty. Only one for tonight. It's a miracle for me. It's not over yet. So I want to pick up where we left off last night and fill in some information that I either feel like we didn't pay enough attention to, or some of it we unfortunately skipped over. I don't really like to follow slide by slide with PowerPoint, but tonight, just so you can see some of the information, and there's a few graphics, and then of course we have our videos, we're going to be a little more dependent on the slides than we might always be. So where we left off is we were talking about the practice of temple prostitution and pederasty. And remember, what we learned is that a proper sexual relationship in the times of the Bible was only seen as a person of more power dominating a person with less power. It was always between people of unequal power or social status. And so anytime that, for example, two men were to think about coming together, being of equal social status, that was a no-no. And also two women coming together, because neither one of them had any status, violated the rules because one could not dominate the other. And then there was this practice that we talked about briefly last week called, anybody remember the word? It starts with a P. Pederasty. There's a little picture for you up there. Pederasty was a practice where either there were young boys, usually in the temple, that folks could, let's go back a slide, I'm not quite there yet. One more. People could have sex with young men in their worship. And to be graphic, but I don't know any other way to say it, the moment when people climaxed was the highly worshipful moment. So there's also the practice where masters, people who trained, like perhaps priests, in our world it would be kind of like a person who supervises clergy students having a right to have sex with them on some level. We don't do that, by the way. I have people that will vouch for it. But it's a place where the person who provided training for these young men also had a right to dominate them. The boys that we're talking about, by the way, and I did not say this last week, were often around the ages of 12 and 13. Now remember, young children even had what we would consider adult-like responsibilities put on them at a much earlier age at this point in time. So 12 or 13 to us sounds like awful, horrible child abuse, and it is. But that might have been a different view that in that day. Now let's get past the picture to the next slide. These relationships between these masters and these young folks were seen as a key part of raising up the next generation of leaders, including political leaders like, the city council or the mayor. There were strict rules about how long the relationship could last and when it would have to end based on the young person's age. And there was also rules around the nature of the relationship while it was going on. But as some of us might expect, there was also some abuse happening in these relationships where the young boys were exploited, and oftentimes the patrons would keep the boys past the age that they were supposed to be committed to their patron. So it might sound something like we would hear in a predatory situation. I've provided all of this luxury for you. You're living in this beautiful house. You have servants. You have your every need met. You have the best food. You have the best gym. You have the best access to the best social activities, the theater, the opera. You're an A-lister in the community as long as you're attached to me. And if you go away, you're going to lose all that. So why don't you just stay a while? And you see how it begins to become manipulative really fast, because the person, the patron with the power and access, is now manipulating the young person to stay beyond the time that the social contract would have been acceptable. So this would mean, too, that now that this boy has reached the age of maturity, what's happened? They're equals. One is an adult male, the other is an adult male. They're now equal. They should have equal rights, except for the manipulation of the predator or the patron. And so suddenly, these two equals being intimate with each other becomes what? A violation of the rules, and perhaps is language we all know as an abomination. Now, these abusive relationships that Paul is referencing are not mutually loving, caring, intentional relationships between people of the same gender. They are not two adult men or women who are attracted to each other and get together and make a choice and a commitment to be with each other. These are relationships that start out with an imbalance of power and perhaps continue through the manipulation of the powerful one or the patron in this case. The manipulation is wrong, and also once that young person reaches the age of majority, it's no longer more powerful or less powerful, it's equally powerful, and therefore violates the social norms. It's also important for us to read all of this from Romans primarily, which Paul has written, in the larger context of the writing of Paul and the life and ministry of Paul. So I just want to share some information with you about that tonight. First of all, and some of you have read or I've written this and taught this for many years, the very worst method of biblical scholarship, it's not scholarship, but biblical interpretation, is a method known as proof texting. That means that, for example, if I want to make it okay for a pastor to be worshipped in a church, I don't, by the way. If you start doing that, we're all going to fall really hard. So save us all a trip down the trail. But proof texting would allow me to go to the Old Testament, to the prophets, to the Psalms, to the Proverbs, and then jump over to Revelation, and back to Matthew, and back over to the writing of Paul, and pick out little snippets of even sometimes parts of sentences to prove my point. It is academic heresy. It does not work. It's also spiritual heresy, because what happens then is we fail to understand the context in the greater work that's been written, and therefore the meaning of what the writer intended. The other thing I want to say to you is that everything that's written in the Bible has multiple meanings. And that sounds crazy to you, but let me illustrate my point. Let's believe together that the Bible, that God inspired the writers of the Bible. So, if we want to be real about it, they're human beings, right? These writers. And so, there was the message that God intended. There was the message that the writer heard, or the inspired one heard. There was the message that the writer took from what he heard and then wrote down on the paper. There was the message that the person who read it heard. And then there's the message that the person who read it shared with the next person. It's just logical that the message changes. It's as if God were to speak to me today and say, write this down, I would not be able to write anything down outside of my 50-something-year-old Southern white, gay, male, clergy, well-educated position in life. All of that stuff would come into play. And so that's true for everybody else. Now, an interesting piece of the puzzle here is that Paul, although he's writing to the Romans at this point, has not even been to visit the church at Rome when these verses are written. Paul is responding to hearsay, he's responding to what people have told him. So in chapter 1, Paul tries to point out behavior of the Gentiles that kept them from God. Gentiles would be people like us, non-Jewish people. In chapter 2, what does he do? Don't worry. He goes right to the same subject with the Jews. He tries to point out behavior of theirs that has kept them from God. And so Paul's reference to natural and unnatural sexual acts has to be taken in the context of that time in Mediterranean sexuality and cultural norms. For example, the Bible, one of the things that gets used against us is that we are committing unnatural acts, right? So if I really pay attention to that and turn my brain on, you know women, I love you, right? So don't take this the wrong way. I really do love you. But for me, the most unnatural sexual behavior I could ever commit would be to have sex with a woman. I have no drive for that. I love you, but I don't even think about you in that way. And so if I were to, in the way society expected me to 30 years ago when I was younger, would have been the most unnatural thing I could do in the context of my life. And even though, and particularly when I was in my teens and 20s, I was in my 20s 30 years ago, Lord have mercy, bless me, Lord. Anyway, society wasn't quite there yet. They would have just nodded and said, yeah, he's doing what he needs to do. Wrong. So Paul is not trying to teach about homosexuality the way we know homosexuality because he hadn't been exposed to it. And by the way, remember, the word had not even been invented yet for centuries. It would come much, much later. What Paul is doing is he's trying to connect with his audience on their own terms by using examples of people who are not upholding the dominant and submissive requirement for sex. It was required. Paul is looking for an opportunity to talk about people's need for what? The saving grace of Jesus. And when we really study Paul carefully, in context, and over time, and look at really good biblical teaching about Paul, we discover that he's not such a scoundrel after all. He's not our enemy after all, because what Paul offers both Gentiles and Jews is the focus on the grace of Jesus, the grace of God through Jesus, more than Paul talks about condemnation and judgment and abominations. By the way, never uses that word. I don't think he ever says the word abomination in his writing. So all of that, just to put some of that discussion from last week in context. Do you have any questions or comments about that? Yes. Oh, wait. Deb is our mic girl tonight. So, yes.
Stay in the contract the right amount of time. Where did they go then?
They could go and pursue their lives. I mean, part of this training was so that they could become city leaders or politicos, respected people. They could pursue whatever career path that was available at the time. That have families, be respectable young men who were pillars of the community. Yes. Anybody else? Questions, comments? Sam, over the mic.
I've always heard about sex being about domination.
Yes.
I've never understood it as that. I've never been in. To say the word the position, to use it as such.
Right.
Up there on your slide, it talked about domination or submissive, and is this where a society is getting that definition of sex is about control and it's about?
Well, I would say, first of all, that was the definition in the Mediterranean society where Paul lived. Now, in our current society, this is just me, and I hope some of you will agree with me. I think the very best we can hope for in an intimate relationship is an intimate relationship between two partners who are equals, who have chosen to be together, who love each other in a soulful way, a godly way. By the way, my sermon on sexuality and spirituality is coming up before too long, so you'll want to be there. It's not too far away. But so I think to answer your question, this whole idea of dominating people is an abuse in a sexual relationship. Now, there are some people that say they get off on it. They have fetishes about being dominated. And if that's your game and it works for you, and you're still respecting each other's boundaries between consensual adults, and my rule is as long as you're not doing damage to each other that sends you to the emergency room. So, I'm just being real with you. A little pain is not the end of the world. Blood worries me. If you end up having to go to the doctor afterwards, you probably should rethink that. But so outside of that fetish behavior, I'm just real about it. Oh, I have to get used to it, right? You've gotten used to it, I hope. But outside of that fetish behavior, a man, I'm just going to say this as a man who has to get his fulfillment and his self-worth by dominating another human being is not a man at all. That is not a behavior. And by the way, just for the record, the same thing for women. A woman who has to hurt her partner, and I've seen it on both sides. And again, there's fetish behavior on both sides. So if you're an adult who agree to that, more power to you, as long as you stay out of the emergency room. But the best sex, after all, the brain is the biggest sex organ we own. It really is all in our brain. We think it's in places lower than that, but the real action happens here. And the best of the best is an equal relationship between mutually consenting adults who are on the same plane with each other. That's mine. Does that answer your question? Anybody else? Others? Questions? Comments? Did you think about this during the week? Did it surprise you when you heard it last week? Okay, no, you're cool with it. I see somebody nodding, yes. Yeah, okay. So, we're going to end that discussion here. Now, I have several videos for us. And one of the things I like to do in this class on this session is to let you hear from another expert. And so, I'll tell you about Dr. Robert Shore-Goss, Bob Goss. I met Bob in 2003 when he was on the MCC ordination interview team that did my interview after I had finished all the requirements to become MCC clergy. He has a doctorate in theology from Harvard Divinity School. Now, if you remember back in the 1980s when we had all ACT UP, any of y'all remember ACT UP? Like some of y'all too young for that. But ACT UP was an organization that misbehaved loudly about HIV funding and all that stuff. Bob wrote a book called Jesus Acted Up in support of doing whatever necessary. Remember, those were the days that President Reagan was refusing to say the word HIV, AIDS, or anything like that, and also refusing to provide any funding for research and treatment. So Bob wrote that book. He's written a number of books, and he is now UCC, United Church of Christ, and MCC credentialed, and a good friend of mine, along with his husband, Joe Shore-Goss, who's working on his doctorate right now. So let's listen to a little Bob, and if it gets too bored, if we get bored with it, we'll cut some, but I think they're worth listening to, and then we'll stop and discuss what he has to say in between. All right, you ready? All right, here we go. Video number 1, Dr. Robert Shore-Goss.
Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. Robert Shore. I am senior pastor of MCC in the Valley. I am a former Jesuit Catholic priest, and I'm one doctorate from Harvard in comparative religion and Christian theology. I am a queer theologian, well published. I want to talk about certainly the issue of homosexuality in the Bible. And I'm not neutral because I am gay. I am a pastor to a church that is gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and heterosexual. In other words, an inclusive community of faith. I want to start off with Peter Jones, who's the chaplain at Harvard, in his book, The Good Book. He says, no credible case against homosexuality or homosexuals can be made from the Bible unless one chooses to read the scriptures in a way that sustains existing prejudice against homosexuality and homosexuals. The problem, of course, is not the Bible, it is the Christians who read it. I want to talk about this by first giving some background information. I anticipate breaking this up into 4 segments. Today on Leviticus verses, the next one on Sodom and Gomorrah, the third on Paul and homosexuality, and the fourth on what Jesus might have said about homoerotic relations. The first thing is, it's a mistake to identify the modern concept of homosexuality as understood by the Bible. Homosexuality is the term that was coined in 1870 in German psychiatric practice as the morbid sexual passion for the same sex, along with the word heterosexuality was coined as a pathological term, being the morbid sexual passion for the opposite sex. The issue is that heterosexuality has been rehabilitated, but homosexuality is not in the 20th century, now in the 21st century with many Christians. I want to say this because certainly if we describe Paul as a closeted homosexual, Paul would never love himself as homosexual. If we describe the disciple Peter, who was married, as heterosexual, that escaped him because he did not understand what heterosexual means yet, or bisexual in the ancient world. So I certainly want to raise that. The next point I want to talk about is how did the ancient world understand sexuality? And the first person to penetrate. In the ancient world, the top, if you will, is the penetrator. It is the male who penetrates women, who penetrates slaves, or lesser males, or youth. And so certainly we have to understand that sexuality is understood in very different terms in the biblical world from the world today of same-sex relationships or even heterosexual relationships as well in consenting adults. I want to say that the Bible has been used to justify slavery, gender oppression, anti-Semitism, colonial domination of the Americas, Asia, and Africa, environmental exploitation, and sexual orientation oppression, and those who are gender different it has been oppressive to. So there's a long list of how the Bible has been used in a very violent way, which is basically to misappropriate the usage of the Bible as a word of grace for a word of violence and oppression. The reason I'm doing this is because there has to be alternative voices to the toxic Christianity that is spewed about the Bible and homosexuality. I want to start talking about Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman is an abomination. And in the latter verse, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, and they shall be put to death. Their blood's upon them. This appears in the holiness trove of the book of Leviticus. And let me start off with an interpretation by the foremost Jewish biblical scholar, Dr. Jacob Milgram, who's written a 3-volume work on Leviticus. He said there are good news and some bad news. He said the good news is if you are a Gentile male, gay male, or lesbian, it's not applicable to you. If you are a Jewish male or lesbian living outside of Israel, it's not applicable to you. It is, if you're a lesbian, period, it's not applicable to you. It is only applicable to Jewish males residing in Israel. You start off with chapter 18, and it starts off, you shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you live, and you shall not do in the land of Canaan, which I will bring to you. And there's a whole list in chapter 18 of do not, which will result in loss of land. If you ask the question, what is this text about? The first thing is, you have to ask, what are the sexual acts that we're talking about? In the first place, in the Jewish tradition, the Orthodox do not believe lesbians can have sex together, because they only understand sex as penetrative sex. In terms of this biblical passage, it is not referring to masturbation or oral sex. It is not referring to intercurrent sex, which is rubbing between bodies. It is referring to anal intercourse. And if we look at the idiom, lying as if you were a female, it really refers to the passive position. And the issue at hand is, certainly the issue is a betrayal of your male status to be penetrated by another male. So it has to do with a gender issue. A culture that defines maleness and femaleness very distinctively. For a male to take on the position assignment of him to a class of females, the degradation of status. This constituted a sort of mixing of kinds, a general taboo occurrence in Hebrew culture. He goes on to say, abomination indicates a crossing of a body from one God-given category to another, analogous to cross-dressing. So the issue is here, there is a mixing and crossing over genders. Male-to-male intercourse mixes gender roles by relegating one partner to the role of the receptive woman. So the issue is not sexuality per se, it is the issue of breaking a gender concept. And certainly we do not have the same gender concepts that is in the biblical Hebrew world. We do not believe that women are sexual property owned by their husbands. So certainly there are some real gender differences. We believe that there is gender equality between husband and wife. We believe in equality between partners, same-sex partners. So therefore, in this text, it cannot be applied to anyone. I also want to point out that those extreme Christians who call for the death penalty, we cannot find anything in Jewish history to sustain that the rabbis ever condemned someone for same-sex relationships and applied the death penalty. They always found loopholes to prevent the death penalty applied to same-sex individuals. I wish the Christian tradition in history did the same, but unfortunately we have a history of violence and violence murder against gay men all through history, and in particular the lethal violence done in our society, justified by religion, to kill folks like Matthew Shepard and other folks. We've been targeted by violence, and the text of the Bible has been moved from a text of grace to a text of violence. And that is not acceptable for any Christians and for the Christians who follow Christ, which is the way and path of nonviolence. Blessings on you.
All right. So, what did you learn that you hadn't heard before? Let's have a little light so we can see each other. What did you hear maybe for the first time? Yes. Oh, I want to hear some women on this. So good. Okay. Go ahead. You're on.
One thing that I took from that is that it was looked more as a sin to act as a woman to men and to take on the role as a female, even talking about the cross-dressing, that was more of the abomination than the actual act, which is a big concern for me considering the sex change.
And what you
Am I going to die from that?
Absolutely
Am I
not.
going to hell because of that?
Absolutely not. Because what you heard Bob say is that it's the same thing I did say, is that if a man, two people are equal, two men. By the way, lesbians, women, you're off the hook. It just doesn't apply to you. So have fun. Permission to proceed. So anyway, but let me answer that because it's very important. The violation is that remember this when I talked about Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot and his friends. The violation in society is that once a man is penetrated, then he loses his status and becomes equal. And I hate this kind of thinking, but it just is the way it was, okay? Can we just acknowledge that? Becomes equal with a woman. You can't be a man and get penetrated. You can't. And it is, in some respects, the powerful person taking on the less powerful role, which could also, as Bob said, have been interpreted as someone who behaves as one of the other gender. Now, I'm going to make a radical statement here, and I am not an expert on trans, but I'm learning a lot by intentional choice. I believe that this, you are a woman. I believe God created you to be a woman. You are a woman. No matter what you had to go through to get there, you are a woman. Say the same thing to Shay. Say the same thing to my female to male trans folk, my cousin Jeremy that I told you I have a crush on. Talked to him a little while this week, by the way. Jeremy's a boy. I know this. Man, boy, whatever, to me, a boy. So that pulls you out of that discussion, even in the Mediterranean context, and certainly puts you, for lack of a better phrase, in safe territory, the way we break down binary gender terms today. So absolutely not, it does not mean you're going down in either situation. But remember also, what was another key thing? If you don't live in Israel, and if you're not Jewish, it doesn't apply to you. And you're neither of those things, neither are any of us. But the point is, we're in Leviticus, the Old Testament writer. I promised my camera sub that I wouldn't move around, but I might have to walk a little way. I'm getting tired of this chair. The writer in Leviticus, or writers, is not talking about sex. They're talking about in their word, their view, my words, the perversion of gender roles. If you're a man, you got to be a man. If you get penetrated, you're not. Especially if you lay in whatever a traditional position might be. I never have figured that out, but anyway. It's more about giving up your masculinity than it is about sex. Okay, something else, somebody else. What did you notice? You can obviously see why light bulbs teach you a lot. You're percolating on something.
It seems to me that a lot of this could be avoided if it wasn't dissected and labeled as orientation, but it be as gender.
Yes, and that gender is absolutely what is being discussed there. As Bob said, according to the very best Jewish scholars, these rabbis that know what they're talking about, way more than I do, they're talking about gender, not about sex. The other thing I want to point out, let's let Kevin go first, and then I'll hit this point in case somebody else doesn't get it. This was the longest of the videos, by the way.
I think that what you pointed out very succinctly was much like in the Christian tradition, is that we're reconciled in church. You know, Jesus died on the cross for our sins. And the fact that he pointed out that in this text of Leviticus, abomination is in fact an abomination against a religious moral value, of which there are means of which to cleanse yourself. So it wasn't to say that, you know, and when in the context of the Jewish faith at that time, that only meant that you weren't able to go to temple.
Exactly.
You didn't mean anything.
That's what I was hoping you'd do.
It didn't mean anything other than the fact that you couldn't go to temple any more than, in theory, if you're a Catholic and you haven't reconciled through the sacrament of confession, you shouldn't present yourself to receive Holy Communion. But it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the eternal salvation of your soul.
Right, exactly right. That's what I was going to go to. Finally, I must say, I hope the folk goes to confession about some of the things we've heard recently from him, but that's off the topic. Kim Davis. Let me get back on subject here. Ritual unfriendliness. So abomination, and then, here's the point, and then I'll move to the next one. I love what he said about the rabbis. There's no record where a rabbi ever sentenced somebody to death. Even if you want to call it about homosexuality, but really in reality about violating gender norms, but he said they always found a loophole. Or they always found a way to reconcile people. And wouldn't our world be such a better place if all practitioners of faith and faith leaders focused on always finding a way for people to live and thrive and have a little joy than to be focused on condemning folks all the time? I made a promise when I came into MCC that I would never do that again. You know, in my Baptist history, I really had to survive. And the day I came into MCC, I said to me, listen, I'll never ever beat somebody up with the Bible again, because I've had enough of that, and my life to last us all for a lifetime. So I love that focus on, even if it's finding a loophole, but what does that remind us of, which we just covered about Paul? Grace. Grace finds a loophole. Yes.
Because it's too loud for my sensitive ears. But I think at the very end he said something about it being in a social context.
Yes.
Very similar to our society overall having quite often a social context of dominance and control. And yes, I wonder what it would be to live in a world where this context was non-judgmental, grace and love and equality and all this that we don't have yet.
But you know what? Even if we just do it here, we're making a little outpost of God's kingdom, as I call it, in here in this place, just by treating everybody, as I say, focusing on enjoying each other's company. All right, let's hear the next video, and then we'll have some more discussion. This was a little shorter than the last one.
I want to start the second one, which I want to call out the chapter of the book Queer in Christ, the practice of same text. I want to deal with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the story of Judges 19, Gideon. Certainly those two stories, if you read them in the actual Hebrew, you find parallel lines in both stories, which indicate that either one story has been borrowed from the other, or they're basically a doublet of an original tale. And I so choose to think that they're probably a doublet that emerged in different parts of the Jewish community. The story be told. The story of Judges 19 in Gibeah is instructive because a Levite, a priest, has a quarrel with his wife, and she's called a concubine, a secondary wife. She goes home to her father, and he goes back to her father's household to take her away. Father-in-law wants to become part of his household, but he refuses because he doesn't want to be subservient, a lesser male in the household, to his father-in-law. So he takes his wife and proceeds, and they come to the city of Gibeah, where a Benjamite gives them certainly hospitality. And then the men of Gibeah come up and they say, bring him out so that we might know him. The word know in Hebrew, Yadah, is used about 1,000 times in the Hebrew scriptures, but there are about 10 particular usages, and this is one of them, in which it refers to sexual relations. But it really, I like to translate it as womanized, because in the ancient world, when an army was defeated, the army would be anally penetrated by the victors to kind of humiliate and denigrate the army that has been defeated. They're humiliated as males made into women. So womanized is probably a real translation for this term. They want the stranger to come out and basically have and rape him. Instead, the wife is pushed out, she is raped, and the next morning she appears silent on the doorstep. The Levite picks her up, puts her on the mule, and takes her back, cuts her out into 12 pieces, and that leads to a war against the Benjamites. This is certainly a story never to apply to same-sex relations, but violence. And certainly we see violence and rape as part of the story. I use this because this is a parallel story that gives us some clue around chapter 19 in Genesis, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's unfortunate that most folks who condemn homosexuality using this story fail to read the chapter before. And the chapter before, two angels come before Abraham, and he partners with them in terms of trying to save Sodom and Gomorrah from the wrath of God. The issues around that is certainly the question of hospitalities is really highlighted there, and we find inhospitality in terms of the treatment or intended treatment in Sodom. So we find that theme going through, and many biblical scholars have looked and said hospitality and inhospitality have been certainly part of the tradition of interpretation. And I will not take away from that because I think there's a valid sort of line of interpretation. I want to talk about the angels coming to Sodom. They were welcomed by Lot. Welcomed into his household. The men of Sodom surround and demand that these strangers be brought out so they might know them. Again, that same word God used, and therefore to rape and womanize them, to denigrate the threat of a stranger. This is xenophobia, the fear of strangers in the ancient world. And certainly the question that comes out here is Lot offers his daughters. Now I hear many folks condemning homosexuality from this text, but they never condemn the certainly patriarchal ownership of women, and Lot offering his daughters to be raped in order to prevent him from undergoing shame that men that he offered hospitality would be raped by others. So the question is, this is certainly a gross violation of hospitality, but it is also violence and rape. We see that males are more important than women in this culture, and none of them will be raped than certainly the two angels. Now, when I look at this, and I see condemnation, blatant condemnation of homosexuality, of gays and lesbians based on this text, the first question I want to say is, we have a real problem with this. No one would identify heterosexual rape with sexuality. It's understood as violence. Why is homosexual rape compared to same-sex relationships that are consensual and non-violent? It doesn't mix apples and oranges, so therefore inapplicable. But if we look for evidence around that, we find that the issue of violence in Sodom is not understood as homoerotic relationships, even in the Hebrew Scriptures. Isaiah 1:9-10 calls it injustice, insincere sacrifice, and oppression. Ezekiel 16:49-50 says, quote, "She did not support the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me," referring to injustice. Jeremiah 23:14 calls sin of Sodom adultery and hypocrisy. Certainly that doesn't seem to fit from their interpretations. Wisdom 19:13-14 calls it a violation of hospitality, which is certainly a genuine theme and a sub-theme there. But if we look to our own understanding of it from Jesus, we find in Q, Matthew 10:14-11, and 11:20-24, and then parallel in Luke 10:12, Jesus understands the sin of Sodom as refusal to welcome strangers. Again, the hospitality. Why is it that Christianity is invested in this interpretation? I think that Christianity is invested in interpretation because it is a later interpretation coming from beyond the 4th century and crystallizing in the 11th and 12th century with Peter Damian, who invents the word sodomy. And in fact, sodomy earlier not miss out. Blessings.
What do you think about that? The next time those people show up and protest us, we're going to put on the sign, Sodomites. What did you learn there? Just he elaborated more on what I shared with you a week or so ago about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, what the Bible says about the sins of Sodom and what Jesus says. Anything new there that you caught? Yes, Sam. Wait for the mic, please.
So, like, I guess approved or not or something, I don't know. This whole, it sounds to me, coming from a place where this is all like at first, you hear
Right.
worldwide cover-up or what? I mean, just...
Well, you know, the Christian church certainly has a history of violence. And people in power will do all kinds of things to protect their power. And acts of male penetration still are not perceived as acceptable for most religious leaders in power. They have to be, I've heard so many sermons about God's man. I get up in the pulpit and talk, I'm God's man. Well, what about God's woman? Yeah, or maybe, what if I'm God's man, even though I'm the gay person, the gay pastor? But unbridled power will do anything to protect itself. Including, say again? Threatened power, and including perversion of the religious text. After all, we know that the Bible has been used to justify slavery. We know the Bible is used to justify racism, bigotry, misogyny, which is male dominance again, xenophobia, the fear of anything that's different or uncommon. The Bible is used to justify the oppression of the poor, still. And all of those are perversions of what the Bible really has to say about those topics, but they keep people in status, secure in their status. So yeah, it's a misuse and a deviation from what the Bible really says. Anybody else on this one? Yes, Karen?
I've heard many of the stories, but this is the first time I've ever heard the version of in time of war when the winners penetrate the losers. I've
Yes.
never heard that.
Absolutely, yes.
And I don't know where they get, gay from that, because I'm sure they're all straight, or majority of them. I've never heard that mentioned, ever.
Yeah, and here's the point, you've got it exactly right there. It's not gay, it's violence. Rape is not gay. Rape is not straight. Rape is not, it's a sexual act, but it is primarily an act of violence and domination and taking away something precious from somebody. It is not about sex, it's about violence. And so to say that I would agree, if we saw American soldiers, we saw some inappropriate behavior from American soldiers in the last few years, and we were just all taken aback by it. We thought it was awful, except for the few that said because they were foreigners, they deserved it, which they're totally off. But we just couldn't believe it. And so, of course it's wrong. Even if you win the war, you don't go around raping all the soldiers or their children or their women. It's just wrong. And that's not about sexual orientation. It's not really even about sex. It's about power and violence and domination. Let's go to the next video. We've got two more. We're going to make it tonight. The next ones are even short. Okay, number 3.
3 on the text of terror, the misapplication of text to homosexuality in the biblical tradition. The last two we've been dealing strictly with the Hebrew scriptures. Today I want to deal with Paul and his translations or our mistranslations of the words that he's used. In 1 Corinthians 6:9, Paul says, "Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, the drunkards, and revilers, robbers, and none of these will inherit the kingdom of God." There's a real issue here with the translation of these terms. The first is melancholy. It is the Greek word meaning luxuriant or soft. And the second is arsenokoitos, a word that we really don't understand the full understanding of what that word meant. It seems to be indicating that these two words are translated, for instance, in the Jerusalem Bible as catamites and sodomites, the passive and active members of male intercourse. The New English Bible aligns these two words together, those who are guilty of homosexual perversion. The New American Bible says sodomites. The New Revised Standard says male prostitutes and sodomites. And the New International Version says male prostitutes and homosexual offenders. This text has been used to justify social policy from such things as opposing same-sex marriage, for instance, in the support of Prop 8 defining marriage as one man or woman, to discriminations against gays and lesbians, to the point that violence is often done to gays and lesbians as targeted because religion justifies it. We have problems with this because these are mistranslations. I want to call attention. Gail Martin, professor of New Testament studies who's written several books on Paul, looked at the word melancholy and found its usage in Hellenistic intertestamental novellas to indicate that melancholy were males, effeminate males, who love to brush their long hair, polish themselves with all sorts of perfumes, and they were addicted to sex, but addicted to the opposite sex. The second word is far more problematic. Arsenokoitos. One of my New Testament translates that as couch potato. It literally means bed male. Oftentimes it's been understood to be prostitute. Certainly it may be some sort of word, but it only appears twice in the biblical tradition and a couple of times in lists in the intertestamental literature that seems to be a list of vices that are involved with economic exploitation that may be included. It also appears in the writings of Hippolytus when he talks about how Zeus took Ganymede to make him his arsenokoitoi, and certainly the devil was trying to do the same with Adam. And if we go back to the myth of Zeus and Ganymede, Ganymede was the youth that Zeus kidnapped on Greek, raped him, and made him his cupbearer. So again, it's not a consensual sex. So also, it may be a problem for Paul's community in the most likely interpretation, because some have seen this as pederastic relationships. I don't think it's pederasty, but I do think it is non-consensual sex between master and slave. This was a problem for Paul's community because many folks who converted to the Christian movement were slaves. How could they, in good conscience, be slaves and yet subject to the sexual whims of their masters? So if this is the case, both terms have been mistranslated and used to justify policies and violence, social violence, targeted at gays and lesbians. Again, mistranslation. And that's the problem we have with those folks who quote these texts was that they did not study the Greek, they did not study the literature, and they don't study scholars. Most scholars behind this like Gail and Martin, Bernadette Bruton at Brandeis University, and Martin Nissen in his book Homoeroticism in the Biblical World, have argued that these words are not applicable to the concept of homosexuality in the 21st century. I want to ask a question, a very interesting question about Paul's life. Bishop Sprague, in one of his prominent books, suggested that the thorn in Paul's flesh is the apostle's own attraction to same sex. And it's based on German biblical scholarship of a very reputable and very good German biblical scholar, Georg Tyson. And if you study Georg Tyson's book, there's a couple of footnotes also going to other German biblical scholars arguing that Paul is what we would call a closeted homosexual. But to use that term is an anachronism because that Paul in the ancient world might have had a closet or were homosexual. But they mean that Paul was attracted to the same sex. Someone talk about Paul's thorn in the flesh as having to do with failing eyesight, some with others on ailments such as seizures and so on. I choose to say that it might be his attraction to the same sex. There was an article in the 1950s done by a psychoanalyst who seemed to have some biblical savvy, and he analyzed Paul and his relations to men. He found that Paul has a problem with authority with older males. Paul likes to have associated around with younger males, Timothy and Titus. Paul's misogyny, and we know that where there's misogyny, there's frequently homophobia. And we may say that there may even be a linkage between internalized homophobia and Paul's own feelings. However, if that's the case, that Paul was attracted to same sex, I think we can look at one of the issues in a very positive way. How Paul dealt with his own sexual attractions. I think his fear of sex with other men may have led him to really sublimate his sexual drive. But he sublimated into a relationship with Christ. And that Christ became the main affection for Paul. He was attracted to Christ. And this insight came out for me when I was a Roman Catholic seminary, when I realized that what we would call the Holy Closet is a prototype of the Catholic priest closet. That we were told to sublimate our sexual desires, but to transfer them directly to Christ. And we can see that intimacy that Paul had with Christ when he said, "It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me."
What do you think about that? Let me break it down with a few questions. What was Paul's thorn in the flesh? Ever thought about that? Have you ever figured it out? What are your previous conclusions?
I always thought this was a physical ailment.
A physical ailment. A lot of people try to go to that conclusion. What else? Paul's thorn. You know about this, right? Is it new to you? I'll break it down a little more. Thorn is something that bothered Paul throughout his life. It could be a physical thing, it could be a sexual thing, it could be an emotional thing. So, what about Paul as a homosexual? Again, as Paul pointed out, it's an anachronism. They didn't have closets or the word homosexuality at that time. Could you fathom Paul in our verse today, a closeted gay person? So, yes, say something about that. Could have been his thorn, yeah. Years 7.
But I think you gotta get to what he said at the very end. I think you have to get to what he says at the very end. It's about the way in which certain segments of society segment,
Yes.
where what is considered sacred homosexuality
Right.
versus our run-of-the-mill secular,
Right.
is the sense that, it's certain, this whole piece of, it wasn't abnormal sex because it was happening
Right.
and it existed. And so therefore to say that he was afflicted by this, unless, because you see again, he's not Jewish, he is Jewish, so therefore he then has to have some attention to the Levitican laws. So that may be his thorn in his side, is that whole piece. But again, it has to be put into the context of the culture as opposed to where that is. And so,
one of the things we do know about Paul's teaching is that he was always trying to find balance between this devout Jewish audience that was present and this Gentile audience that was also present. And so as we talked about earlier, in one chapter we'll see Paul adamantly addressing the behavior of Gentiles. The second chapter he's adamantly addressing the behavior of Jews. And there is this idea in Catholic seminary life, Catholic priests are expected to take a vow of celibacy, that you subjugate sexual feelings for Christ. That you, whatever, I think it sounds a little perverted just for me, but anyway, you transfer your sexual drives and focus on Christ. But it also reminds me, are you all familiar with Exodus International? It's one of the older programs that focused on straightening people out in the name of Jesus. I'm an alum of it. You see how well it worked, don't you? But I'm one of their greatest success stories. Queer and all. Anyway, one of the things they taught us, and I'll never forget this line. I can say it just like this was the 1980s, a long time ago. Here it is. If you really fall in love with Jesus, he will so spoil you that you'll never need another man in your life. I got you in a second. But doesn't that sound like the same thing? Now you're going to say exactly what I said to him. Go for it. No? You're not going to say it? No? Well, my first response to that was, what about the women? They said, you don't need to worry about that. The second one is, where's Jesus going to be when I'm home in bed? Anyway, I didn't last too long in that program. I had an Exodus boyfriend, I confess. Two, as a matter of fact. So it didn't all work out too well the way it was planned to me. But anyway, I'm going to tell you this. For me personally, I feel for me, I admire Bob's scholarship. He's a very smart man. And some of us end up at different locations on the journey. For me to say Paul was a gay man, homosexual, same gender loving man is a stretch. I can't quite get there as firmly as Bob does. On the other hand, he's not convinced about pederasty, and I am. So, our journeys take us sometimes to slightly different conclusions, but we're all in the same ballpark. So, I always want to say when I show this video, we all, even people who study their whole lives, still come up with a little different conclusions. And that's okay. And by that, I mean to give you permission, your conclusions might be good too. We'll look at the final video, which is only 5 minutes.
I want to go back to that statement you made about if you put your love into Jesus.
Yes, yes.
But you have to understand, it's my thinking, we're humans.
Yes.
Adam and Eve has a mind of his own.
Yes, amen. He says your anatomy has its own mind.
Doesn't mean that Jesus.
Right.
I do. I think I do. But sometimes.
Amen. I hear you. I'm with you.
When I was younger, I used to lock myself in my room because I didn't want to be gay or homosexual or anything.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't go out.
Yeah.
couldn't stop what was going on with my body. So,
It's amazing. I agree with you. And let me just say, dark skin, hair, beard, I probably would have thought it was hot. Bear cub, can you say? All right, I'm not going any further than that. Y'all might call the board on me. You know what? There's a board member in the room. You heard me say it live. Nobody has to call me. Jesus was hot. Amen. All right, final video.
For many years, the question, did Jesus say anything about homoerotic relations, has always kind of puzzled me. In the last 2 decades, I've seen a very cute thing in queer churches, and that is the pamphlet. Did Jesus say anything about homosexuality? And open up and there's a blank page. And then it's been the position that Jesus has never said anything about homoerotic relations. I have to say that I revised my thinking of that. And it comes out of reading the Hughes story that we find in Matthew 5, 8, chapters 5 through 13, and Luke chapter 7, 1 through 10. It's a story about the centurion and his boy. Matthew uses the word hais, which would indicate where we get pederasty. In the ancient world, a pederastic relationship was an older male went through a younger male between the ages 12 and 18. Oftentimes it was their erotic mentor. And certainly centurions were not allowed to be married in the Roman army. They were allowed to have concubines and slaves and their boys. Luke's uncomfortable with that and certainly recognizes it. And he changes the word hais to doulos. We translate that servant, but really a slave. And he calls the slave intimos, which means dear or intimate, where we get it. He's precious. And certainly the centurion comes to Jesus and he says, can you heal my boy? Can you come and heal my servant? And Jesus says, I will come. But he says, Lord, I am not worthy for you to come into my room, but say the word, and my servant and my boy will be healed. At that moment, the boy is healed. The youth is healed. Jesus says about the centurion, there is no greater faith that I found in Israel. Certainly, Jesus was not naive about the relationships between centurion and his boy, that it was a pederastic mentoring, erotic mentoring. It didn't seem to bother him. He healed the youth. And in terms of not only healing the youth, I'm sure there were critics in Capernaum saying, look at him. He's healing those Gentiles. And besides that, they violate the Torah. If a man sleeps with a man like a woman, it's an abomination. Look, he's performing an abomination by healing an abomination. I'm sure there were critics such as Pharisees, and we have those Pharisees in many churches today. Those churches that condemn LGBT folks who have excluded them. MCC is a community that has been inclusive. We are an inclusive community of exiles who have rejected toxic Christianity and believe that all Christians are welcome at the table. I want to say one particular note about the verses. I grew up in a Roman Catholic setting, going to communion every week. Every week I said, as I received communion, Lord, I am not worthy to receive you, but only say the word and I shall be healed. The words of that homoerotic centurion who slept and had sex with the youth have been immortalized in the practices of tens of millions of Catholics every Sunday. It is commemorated. Did Jesus say something about homoerotic relations in the ancient world? Yes. No greater faith have I found. I take that as a word of grace. Because every Sunday I celebrate the Lord's Supper with a community of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and heterosexual folks. And that all are inclusively welcome at the table. care for the poor in North Hollywood. We care for those who are HIV, for those with breast cancer, for those who are poor, those who are oppressed. Europe itself that is oppressed by human beings by exploitation. We care for those around the world. We have contributed to HIV kids who are in
Okay, these thoughts of homosexuality in the Bible and promoting MCC. Now we know about that because we do the same things. What do you think about that one? You familiar with the story of Jesus and the Roman centurion? Intimos doulos is the key phrase. Doulos is slave. Intimos is intimate, beloved, precious. Well, yes.
Would that be the same kind of wording maybe when it speaks in Daniel that he had a tender love to the Prince of Humans?
It could be. I'd have to look at the language though, because I don't know off the top of my head what the original words are there. But it could be. Intimos doulos, basically it means my boy, and not my son. You know what I'm talking about? It's me, somebody my age, or somebody younger, he's my boy. And Jesus knows what he's talking about. And so does everybody around him. And Jesus heals the boy. And as Bob insinuates, says, that statement has been immortalized in the practice of the Roman Catholic Church, which is said by millions of Catholics in one language or another every Sunday. And so maybe that may be the one place where Jesus did at least insinuate something about queer relationships. In our final 5 minutes, I want to talk to you about one more subject, and that is the question of biblical authority. When I say to you, in terms of biblical authority, what are your views? Let me give you some examples. The Southern Baptist view that I grew up with is that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God. That means that every word in it is accurate, and even the ones that contradict each other are accurate. It is the inerrant Word of God. My statement, and buckle your seatbelts if this is shocking to you, but I say the Bible is the manual for the practice of the Christian faith. However, it is neither a science nor a history text. What's your view of biblical authority? How would you describe it? You ever given that any thought? Yes, right?
I had to start because I was raised Catholic, like the nuns and kind of stuff. So I had a different perspective of the Bible when I grew up. But now that I'm old, I look at it as a reference book. Something to look. But it's not perfect. There's a lot of flaw and a lot of hearsay. People passing one story to another. And it happened 2,000 some years ago. And things have changed from that time to today. And people are still using what happened then and trying to fit it into our society, which makes us feel bad. And, you know, forgive me if I'm always saying no, but I don't think I am. And what I am, it took me a long time to get there.
Great, thank you, Kevin, or somebody back there while the mic is close. Come on down.
I'd like to take what you said as a guidebook.
Yes,
And
a manual for the practice of Christian faith.
And it is only that can be that way because it is a collection of allegorical writing. In other words, every story, both Old and New Testament, is meant for you to insert yourself in that situation. The sin mentioned can be inserted any sin. So when somebody talks about what's the sin of the woman at the well, it doesn't make any difference what her sin is. If you're the woman, then what is your sin that got you to that point? On the same token, if you're the one standing there with a stone in your hand, how did you get to have that judgmental position to think that you need to condemn this person? Again, keeping in mind that if you read the text, it's almost always the ladies who have gotten themselves into trouble. It seems that way. You never see about the man who's committed. There's not a man at the well. And so I think that you have to keep in mind that if you read it allegorically and not verbatim and literally, then it allows you to use it every time, when you read a parable, when you read those stories in the Old Testament. It's really meant for you to insert. It should have lots of little parenthetical places. Insert your name here. Right. Insert your sin here. Insert your reaction here. Because that's the authority of the Bible, is how does it impact your life? Because you understand what is causing you to be closer to God.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have to just say, in general, women get a bad rap in the Bible. Eve was framed, and it got worse from there. Biblical authority, any other perspectives? How do you see biblical? How does the Bible impact you? Yes.
A perfect God with an imperfect kids.
Yes. So, one of the things that just as a fact, for example, the Gospel of Mark was the first one to be written. It was maybe 100 years after the life of Jesus on earth. Imagine if one of us tried to write about what happened today 100 years from now. What would that be like? I'm teaching the class and I might have trouble. I'm just saying. But it is the manual. This is the thing. The Bible, you've heard me say this if you've been around here for very long, the Bible is so important to me that when all of these struggles became real in my life, I couldn't just throw it away. I really wanted to. You've heard me say this before, when I drove out the gates of that Baptist Seminary in New Orleans on Gentilly Boulevard, I still remember as I go by and see that steeple sticking up over there that makes the creeks. I thought I was done. I said, okay, Joy Perry called me the first time. I said, no, Joy, I'm done with that. But there was something about the Bible that I just could not let it go. And so, much like you see Jacob with the angel, fighting with the angel all night, and said, I wrestle, I will not let you go until you bless me. And that's what I think about the Bible. It is so important to us. And no, the traditional interpretations don't necessarily work for us, nor are they necessarily accurate. But for people like us, the Bible has so much to say to us. And there is truth in the Bible that brings us right smack dab into the center of God's will for our lives, into the realm of God, into our status as children of God, so that nobody can take that away from us. So one of the reasons I teach courses like this, and we're going to continue next week, is because I want to help inspire you to embrace the Bible as your experience too. Yes, we have to look at it in different ways, but there's so much in there that can bless us and enrich our lives that I hope all of us are willing to wrestle with it and not to let it go until it blesses us. So, next week, Tuesday at 7, and we're going to look at some of the ancient literature. We're going to look at some cultural aspects. And then the final week, we wrap up and the end of the course. So, I want to read this to you. There's somebody wishes you good night every day, you are happier than so many people. So, questions, anybody? Anything you want to ask or bring up tonight? Thank you so much for being here again. Oh, my media team. Give them a hand. Yes, the fine lady. You see, it takes way more than me to pull this off, so I appreciate all of my helpers tonight. Thank you so much. Have a good night. Oh, hold on one second. If you have those, give it to Lou. Do we have a little stack of them up here for you? All right. I do. Have one more, a few more, I think. Thank you all. Have a good night.